Don't make this uglier than it needs to be.
Talia Avery. My family has been looking for you for 13 years.
Bianca Rhodes was the one who sent the message. Not Malcolm, not even a lawyer, just his girlfriend typing from his office. Don't make this uglier than it needs to be. I came home to find Malcolm's wedding ring sitting on top of a signed divorce decree. No conversation, no warning, just a business card from a moving company and a security guard informing me my access to the house would expire in 1 hour, the same house I had poured my savings into when no one else believed in him. I was dragging my suitcases through the gate in the rain when the street went dark. 18 armored SUVs blocked every exit in Kingsley Park. A limousine with a silver W emblem stopped directly in front of me, and an older woman stepped out and said, "Talia Avery, my family has been looking for you for 13 years. Why had the most powerful black family in the country been searching for a woman her own husband had just thrown away? If you're new here, this channel tells stories about people who were counted out and came back as something no one expected. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. I used to think that love was enough to hold a life together. That if you showed up every single day, if you gave everything you had without being asked, the person you gave it to would eventually see what that was worth. I believed that for 16 years. I believed it right up until the afternoon I came home and found a moving company's business card sitting next to my husband's wedding ring. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand what happened that day, you have to understand what the years before it looked like, because what Malcolm did to me didn't begin the morning I found that divorce decree. It began long before, quietly, in the way that the worst things usually do. When I first met Malcolm Merritt, I was 24 years old and working night shifts at Larkhaven Rehabilitation Institute. I wasn't glamorous. I wasn't connected. I was a physical therapist with loan debt, a father getting sicker by the month, and a belief that if you worked hard enough, you'd eventually build something that lasted. Malcolm was a real estate broker with almost no clients, a cheap suit he wore to every meeting, and a vision so big it made people uncomfortable. He used to spread property maps across my kitchen table and talk for hours about buying up neglected neighborhoods and turning them into something the city could be proud of. Most people changed the subject when he got going. I stayed and listened. I asked questions. I told him I thought he could actually do it. My father, Lionel Avery, was an engineer. He spent his life solving problems that other people couldn't see yet. He raised me to believe that the most valuable thing a person could do was build something real and put their name on it honestly. When he got sick, I moved back into the house I grew up in and took care of him between shifts. He passed away during the winter I turned 26, and what he left behind wasn't much by most people's standards. A small mechanic's workshop, some tools, a red metal box he kept on his workbench, and a name he'd spent his whole life trying to make mean something. I sold the workshop. I used most of the money to help Malcolm register his company and cover the first 6 months of operating costs. I co-signed the initial loan because his credit alone wouldn't qualify. I told myself it was an investment in our future. Malcolm told me we were partners. He said those words specifically, "Whatever this becomes, it belongs to both of us." In the years that followed, Merritt and Rhodes' urban capital grew faster than either of us had expected. Malcolm had real talent. He could read a room, sell a vision, and close deals that should have fallen apart. I watched him become the man he'd always talked about being, and I was proud of him. I was genuinely proud. What I didn't fully register not until much later was that as the company grew, my place inside it quietly shrank. I had left Larkhaven to help with the business, but I didn't have a title or a salary or shares in my own name. Malcolm said those things were formalities between people who loved each other. He said the company was ours the way the marriage was ours, no paperwork needed. So I kept working. I organized fundraising dinners. I built relationships with community leaders who became Malcolm's clients. When his father had a stroke, I was the one who managed his care and coordinated with the medical team while Malcolm stayed focused on a development deal he said he couldn't walk away from. I hosted investors in our home, prepared the kind of environment that made serious people feel comfortable enough to sign. None of that work had a job title. None of it appeared on a balance sheet. But it was real, and it was mine, and for a long time I believed Malcolm knew that even if he never said it out loud. Then Bianca Rhodes came on board as chief strategy officer, and everything I'd built my understanding of our marriage on began to disappear, not all at once, but steadily, like water wearing down stone. Bianca was sharp in a way that made rooms shift when she walked into them. She knew exactly how to position Malcolm, how to dress up his proposals, how to make investors feel like they were getting access to something exclusive. I didn't dislike her at first. I actually thought she was good for the company. What I didn't see until it was too late was that she had also made herself indispensable to Malcolm in ways that had nothing to do with work. She told him, and I only pieced this together much later from things people let slip, that his image needed to evolve, that the wife who worked in rehabilitation didn't fit the profile of the CEO he was becoming, that the dinners I hosted and the relationships I'd spent years cultivating were fine for where he'd been, but not for where he was going. Malcolm never argued with her about it. He never came to me and said any of this directly. He just began slowly and without announcement to stop including me. The invitations to business dinners stopped coming. The introductions at events became shorter than absent. His assistant started handling scheduling that I used to manage. He moved into the guest room without explanation, changed his phone password, and began communicating with me through notes left on the counter or brief texts sent by someone on his team. When I tried to talk to him about what was happening between us, he would look at me with an expression that wasn't anger. It was something colder than anger. It was the look of a man who had already made a decision and simply hadn't told you yet. My friend Janelle Pierce saw it before I was willing to. Janelle had known me since before Malcolm, and she had a way of saying difficult things without flinching. She told me more than once that what Malcolm was doing had a name, that using silence as a permanent response to someone you're supposed to love wasn't distance, it was control. I told her she didn't understand the pressure he was under. I made excuses I'm not proud of now. That was my mistake, and it was the last one I made inside that marriage. The afternoon, everything collapsed, was an ordinary one. I had spent the morning visiting a former patient, a woman in her 70s. I still checked on sometimes because her family lived out of state. On the drive home, I remember thinking about stopping for groceries, about whether Malcolm would be home for dinner, about small and ordinary things. I pulled up to the gate of our community in Kingsley Park, and the system didn't recognize my access code. The security guard at the booth looked uncomfortable when I rolled down the window. He said there must be a system update and let me through manually, but then he told me something that made my hands go cold on the steering wheel. He said my residential access would be terminated in 1 hour. I walked into the house and stood in the front hallway for a long time before I could make myself move forward. Malcolm's closet was empty. His personal items, the watch collection, the cufflinks I'd given him on our 10th anniversary, the framed photo from our wedding, all gone. The bedroom looked like a hotel room someone had just checked out of. In the kitchen, on the dining table we had picked out together at a furniture store in downtown Charlotte, there were 3 things: his wedding ring, a legal document with a court seal at the top, and a business card for a moving and storage company. I picked up the document first. It took me several minutes to understand what I was reading because the language was formal and my hands wouldn't stop shaking. But the meaning was clear enough. The divorce had been finalized. Not filed, finalized. The date on the court stamp was weeks earlier. I had not been notified. I had not appeared at any hearing. According to the paperwork, I had waived my right to receive notice, and the settlement had been processed in my absence. I sat down on the floor next to the table. I'm not sure how long I stayed there. I called Malcolm's number, and it went directly to a message saying the number was no longer accepting calls from my contact. I called again from a different screen, and it rang twice before going silent, blocked. I sent a text that showed delivered, then immediately showed that delivery had been revoked, which meant he had set up filtering. He had prepared for this call. He had prepared for all of it, probably for months, while I was driving to check on elderly patients and planning dinners and filling in every gap in his life that he'd never once acknowledged. The only person who reached out was Bianca. Her message arrived while I was still sitting on the floor. Don't make this uglier than it needs to be. That was the entire message. No context, no pretense of sympathy. 7 words that told me exactly how much she and Malcolm had discussed this moment before it happened. I understood in that instant that I hadn't simply been left. I had been managed out. The silence, the guest room, the passwords, the assistant handling my calls. None of it had been the behavior of a man drifting away. It had been preparation. Malcolm had been building a wall around everything he intended to keep, and he had done it carefully enough that by the time I noticed the door was already sealed from the other side. I don't know what I expected to feel. Fury, maybe. Instead, I felt something quieter and more disorienting, a kind of vertigo, like the floor of everything I understood had tilted without warning. I stood up, went to the bedroom, and opened my side of the closet. My clothes were still there, my toiletries, the photo of my father on the nightstand. These were the things that had not been taken because they were the things Malcolm had never considered worth claiming. I took 2 suitcases from the shelf and started packing. Not in a panic, deliberately. I left the jewelry Malcolm had given me over the years because every piece of it had been chosen to match the image he wanted me to project. I left the event dresses and the heels and the carefully coordinated wardrobe of a corporate wife. I packed my work clothes, my personal documents, and my father's red toolbox that I had kept in the back of the closet since I sold his workshop. That box was the only thing in the house that had ever truly belonged to me before Malcolm. I pulled the suitcases through the front door and down the driveway in the rain. The security guard didn't look at me as I passed his booth. I stepped out onto the sidewalk at the edge of Kingsley Park and stood there with water running down the back of my neck, and I had no idea where I was going to sleep that night. That was when I heard a low rolling sound from the far end of the street growing steadily louder. I turned and saw headlights. Not one pair, not 2. A long column of black SUVs moving in formation, unhurried, filling the road from edge to edge. 18 vehicles in total. At their center, a limousine so long it took up the span of 3 parking spaces, carrying a silver letter W on its door panel that caught the light even through the rain. The convoy stopped. Doors opened. Men in dark clothing moved quickly and without noise, forming a perimeter, not around the house, not around the gate, but around me where I stood on the sidewalk with 2 suitcases and nowhere to go. I saw curtains moving in the windows of neighboring homes. I saw someone raise a phone. I saw Malcolm's face appear briefly at the upstairs window of the house, our house, the house I had helped pay for before stepping back out of view. The rear door of the limousine opened. A woman stepped out. She was older, elegantly dressed, despite the rain, and she moved with the particular steadiness of someone who had not been uncertain about a decision in a very long time. She looked at me, not at the house, not at the suitcases, but directly at me, and spoke clearly enough that the people recording from their windows would have heard every word. "Talia Avery," she said, "my family has been searching for you for 13 years, and we are not leaving without you." Her name was Odessa Waverly. I did not know that yet. What I knew in that moment was only that she had called me by a name I hadn't used since I got married, my father's name, my real name, and that the way she said it made it sound like something that had been waiting to be returned to me. I picked up my suitcases and walked toward the car. The Waverly estate sat outside Charlotte on a stretch of land that didn't announce itself from the road. There were no gates with gold lettering, no fountains visible from the highway. Just a long private drive through old trees that eventually opened onto something so quietly substantial it made most displays of wealth look like performance. I sat in the back of that limousine with my 2 suitcases at my feet and my father's red toolbox on the seat beside me, and I told myself I was being rational by going with them. The truth was, I had nowhere else to go, and the woman sitting across from me had said my name like it was something she'd been carrying for a long time. Odessa Waverly waited until we were inside and seated before she said anything of substance. She had the kind of patience that doesn't feel like restraint. It feels like choice. She looked at me across the sitting room and said, "I imagine you have questions. I'll answer all of them. But I need to tell you something first, and I need you to hear it before you decide what to believe." I told her I was listening. What she described was not what I had expected. 13 years earlier, Odessa had been in a serious car accident, one that her family had worked hard to keep out of the press. At the time, the Waverly Consortium was navigating a period of vulnerability. There were people who knew the company's internal structure well enough to exploit it, and some of them had made clear they were willing to do exactly that. When Odessa was transferred to Lark Haven Rehabilitation Institute for Spinal Recovery, she was registered under a false name. Her family visited in rotation, never more than one at a time, never publicly. The staff at Larkhaven knew only that their patient was a private woman with no listed next of kin who did not want to be disturbed. She told me she had been, in her own words, a terrible patient. The injury had taken her ability to walk temporarily, and for a woman who had built an empire on the certainty of her own capabilities, that loss was more than physical. She was furious in a way that had nowhere useful to go, and she directed it at every person who came near her. Most of the staff requested reassignment within the first 2 weeks. The facility rotated through 4 different therapists before the situation stabilized. "You were the one who stayed," Odessa said. I remembered her. I hadn't known her name, not her real one, but I remembered her clearly. A woman in her late 60s, sharp-eyed with the posture of someone who had never once been told to sit up straight because she had always simply done it. I remembered that she refused the standard exercises, and that the only way to get her to engage was to stop treating her like a patient and start talking to her like a person. I used to read the newspaper to her in the mornings. I brushed her hair when her hands weren't steady enough. I stayed past the end of my shift more times than I ever logged officially because I could see that the anger she was projecting outward was built on top of something much quieter. The fear that she might not recover, and that if she didn't, the life she had built would go on without her. One night she told me she wanted to stop, that she was done with the therapy, done with the pretending, done with all of it. I didn't argue with her. I sat down beside her bed, put her hand on the rail, and said, "People can take a lot of things from you, but they can only erase your name when you stop standing up for it yourself." I don't even remember deciding to say that. It came out of me the way things do when you're tired and you stop filtering yourself, and it just happens to be true. Odessa looked at me now from across the sitting room with an expression I couldn't quite categorize. "That was the night I decided to get back up," she said. "And when I was well enough to find you, you were already gone. You'd gotten married, changed your name, left the institute." She had searched for Talia Avery for over a decade. The name Talia Merritt had never connected back to the woman she was looking for. I sat with that for a moment. Then I asked her the question I'd been holding since the limousine pulled away from Kingsley Park. "You called me an heir. What does that mean?" Everett Waverly. Odessa's nephew, who had been quiet in the corner of the room until this point, stood and asked me to follow him. The archive room was on the 2nd floor, temperature-controlled, lined with flat files and document cases organized by decade. Everett moved through it with the ease of someone who had spent years in there. He pulled a folder from a drawer near the back and set it on the table in front of me, opening it to a page covered in handwritten technical notation. At the bottom right corner was a signature I recognized the way you recognize a voice on a phone call before the person says their name. Lionel Avery. My father's handwriting. Everett explained it carefully without rushing. Before I was born, my father had worked alongside the founding generation of the Waverly family on an engineering problem that had been stalling a major expansion of their freight operation. My father designed a rail coordination system, a method of managing switching sequences across multiple lines simultaneously that reduced collision risk and cut transit time between industrial hubs by nearly a third. It wasn't a minor contribution. It was the infrastructure on which the logistics division of Waverly Consortium was built. According to the original agreement, my father held a partial equity stake in the technology division in exchange for his work. He never received it. A senior executive at the time, a man who had been dead for over 20 years, falsified the records, removed my father's name from the patent filings, and reported to the Waverly family that Lionel Avery had accepted a cash buyout and walked away voluntarily. My father went to his grave not knowing the agreement had been buried. The Waverly family went decades not knowing it had existed. A comprehensive audit, led by Calvin Reddick, the head of their internal forensic team, had turned up the original contract, my father's technical journals, and a series of payments that were prepared but never sent. The equity stake plus decades of accumulated dividends and value growth had been calculated by 3 independent firms. The total figure was just under $500 million. I looked at Everett and said I didn't understand how that connected to me. He pointed to a clause near the bottom of the original agreement, a clause written in my father's own language because my father had insisted on it. The ownership rights attached to the technology could not be transferred through marriage. They could not be assigned to any party outside of a direct blood descendant. My father had been careful. He had understood that agreements could be manipulated, and he had built in a wall that no contract, no court settlement, and no signature from me could legally breach. Whatever I signed, whatever Malcolm had persuaded or tricked me into putting my name on, none of it could transfer these rights. The law was not on Malcolm's side. It had never been because my father had made sure of it. That was when I understood what Malcolm had actually done. He had learned about the Waverly search through a contact in Charlotte's financial community. He had understood immediately what it meant that a woman named Talia Avery was about to become very wealthy, and that his wife was that woman. Rather than telling me he had spent the following months constructing an exit. The divorce was timed, not because he had fallen out of love or found someone new. He and Bianca had been involved for over 2 years by then, but because he needed me legally separated and financially isolated before the Waverly family found me. A wife could make claims. A divorced woman with no assets and a settlement agreement on file was a different matter entirely. The Waverly Consortium restored my father's name in their founding records and offered me a voting seat on the board overseeing the logistics division. Odessa made clear this was not charity. It was a correction. The video of the convoy arriving at Kingsley Park had already been circulating online for hours by the time any of this was explained to me. I didn't know that until Everett showed me his phone. The footage was grainy someone's neighbor recording through a window in the rain, but it was clear enough. 18 SUVs, a limousine. Odessa stepping out and speaking to a woman with 2 suitcases standing in the rain. The clip had been shared widely enough that Malcolm had already seen it. I know this because he called while I was still sitting in the archive room, and when I didn't answer, he drove to the estate. He stood at the entrance with the composure of someone who had prepared a speech and intended to deliver it regardless of the audience. He said the divorce had been a mistake made under pressure, that he had lost his direction, that he wanted to correct it publicly, restore my name to the company, acknowledge everything I had contributed. He spoke with the fluency of a man who had spent years perfecting the art of saying the right thing slightly too late. I looked at him and asked one question. If that convoy hadn't shown up last night, were you ever going to speak to me again? He didn't answer. The silence was answer enough. I told him he hadn't lost me on the day the divorce was finalized. He had lost me the day he decided his silence was worth more than my dignity. I walked back inside and Everett closed the door. Malcolm did not leave quietly. Within 48 hours, Merritt and Rhodes Urban Capital filed an emergency motion to freeze the Avery equity stake. Malcolm's legal team produced a document notarized, formatted correctly, carrying what appeared to be my signature, showing that I had transferred all rights connected to my father's assets to my husband in exchange for partial ownership in his company. I had no memory of signing anything like it. The signature looked like mine in the way a very good copy always does, close enough to create doubt. Bianca moved simultaneously on a second front. She had clearly been briefed on enough details about my time at Larkhaven to make her story credible. Malcolm had obtained my employment records through a contact at the facility's former administrative office, which gave her the framework she needed. She fed a story to 3 separate outlets, suggesting I had cultivated a relationship with a vulnerable elderly woman during a period of medical incapacity, then leveraged that relationship for financial gain once the woman's true identity became known. The framing was careful and deliberate. It turned the story of a rehabilitation therapist caring for a patient into something that looked from a certain angle like manipulation. Several members of the Waverly board contacted Everett privately to express concern. They asked Odessa to consider delaying the formal transfer of voting rights until the legal questions were resolved. Then the forensic audit turned up something worse. My name and signature appeared on loan guarantees connected to several of Malcolm's riskier development projects that had received community reinvestment funds and delivered almost nothing to the neighborhoods they were supposed to serve. I had never knowingly signed those documents. But there they were. And if they couldn't be proven false, I wasn't just looking at losing an inheritance. I was looking at potential liability for financial fraud. I told Odessa I wanted to step back, that the damage being done to her family's reputation wasn't worth it, and that I would rather walk away than drag the consortium into a legal fight I might not survive. I meant it when I said it. I was exhausted in a way that went deeper than tiredness, the kind of exhausted that comes from realizing the person you trusted most had been planning against you for months while you were still trying to save the marriage. Odessa listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "If you walk away because Malcolm wrote a story about you, he will have erased your name for the second time. And this time you'll have done it for him." I didn't have a response to that. She was right, and we both knew it. I agreed to stay. I submitted my full personal records, voluntarily accepted an independent audit of my finances, and made myself available to every investigator the court appointed. It was the first time in as long as I could remember that I had fought for myself, instead of absorbing the consequences of someone else's choices in silence. That same night, Malcolm sent a private message through his attorney. He would testify that I had no knowledge of the fraudulent loans. He would clear my name completely. In exchange, I would transfer the majority of the Avery equity into a fund under his management, and we would make a joint public appearance presenting ourselves as a couple who had reconciled. He wasn't asking me back because he wanted me. He was asking me back because he needed to own the one thing my father had protected with his name. The stress of the legal proceedings and the public attention had caught up with Odessa by then. She was admitted to the hospital that evening with a sharp rise in blood pressure, something her doctors had been warning the family about for days. Some members of the household looked at me when they got the news, and I understood what that look meant, even if no one said it directly. I sat outside her room in the hospital corridor for 2 hours before a nurse told me Odessa was stable and resting. I didn't leave until I knew she was going to be all right. That night I called Janelle. I hadn't told her how bad things had gotten. I hadn't told anyone. But I called her now and I didn't dress it up. I just said I didn't know what to do. She didn't say she'd warned me. She didn't offer solutions. She just said she was coming over, and 40 minutes later she was sitting next to me on the edge of the guest bed in the Waverly estate, not saying a word, her hand on my shoulder. That quiet was the only kindness I had received that had nothing attached to it. I let myself lean into it for exactly as long as I needed to, and then I straightened up and I started thinking about how to fight back. I didn't sleep that night. After Janelle left, I sat at the small desk in the guest room and looked at my father's red toolbox for a long time before I opened it. I had carried it out of Kingsley Park almost by instinct. It was the one object in that house that had existed before Malcolm that had never belonged to the version of me he'd shaped. I kept it closed for weeks the way you keep certain things closed when you're not ready for what they might make you feel. But that night, with Malcolm's offer sitting in my phone and a court date 2 days away, I lifted the lid. The top layer was what I expected, a folding ruler, a set of calibration tools, a small flashlight my father had kept in there since I was a child. Beneath that were his notebooks, 3 of them filled with the dense, precise handwriting of a man who documented everything because he believed that if something was worth doing, it was worth recording accurately. Tucked between the second and third notebooks was a stack of carbon paper, the kind my father used as a matter of habit whenever he signed anything significant. He'd told me once that a signature without a copy was just a gesture. He didn't trust gestures. At the bottom of the box beneath the carbon sheets was a folded document in a plastic sleeve. I recognized the format before I finished unfolding it. It was a contract, the original agreement between Lionel Avery and the founding partners of the Waverly Consortium. My father's copy, the one he had kept. I brought it to the lamp on the desk and read every line slowly, and when I reached the clause near the bottom, the one Everett had described in the archive room, I read it 3 more times. The language was my father's. Clear, precise, and unambiguous ownership rights attached to the technology contribution were non-transferable through marriage or any agreement made by a party outside the direct bloodline. This clause had not been written by lawyers trying to protect a corporation. It had been written by an engineer who understood that the most important things needed to be protected before someone decided to take them. The document Malcolm had presented to the court did not contain this clause. A non-transfer clause doesn't disappear from a contract through oversight. You remove it because it defeats your purpose. Malcolm had known this clause existed, had known it made any document he created legally meaningless, and had removed it anyway because he was counting on no one finding the original. I called Everett at 6 in the morning. He came to the guest room within 20 minutes, still in his jacket from the night before, which told me he hadn't slept either. I handed him the plastic sleeve without saying anything. He read it standing up. Then he set it down on the desk very carefully, the way you handle something you understand to be significant. And he said, "This is the document that ends it." Calvin Reddick's team had been running parallel forensic analysis on the electronic records for days. When Everett brought them the original contract that same morning, the pieces assembled quickly. The fraudulent version of the agreement, the one without the non-transfer clause, the one bearing what appeared to be my signature, had been created on a computer registered to Bianca Rhodes, traced through document metadata to a date roughly 6 weeks before Malcolm initiated divorce proceedings. The file had been modified 4 times. The final version was printed the day after a private investigator Malcolm had hired confirmed that the Waverly Consortium's search had narrowed to Charlotte. The emails that had been used to suggest I was aware of the fraudulent loan structure were equally traceable. Every one of them had been sent during hours when I was documented as being inside a patient care facility that prohibited personal devices in treatment areas. The login data showed the messages originated from an IP address registered to the Merritt and Rhodes Urban Capital Office building. Someone had accessed an email account in my name from Malcolm's office while I was working a shift and couldn't have been anywhere near a computer. Years earlier, after a server crash nearly wiped the company's early financial records, I had quietly backed everything up onto a personal hard drive and stored it with my father's belongings, the same belongings Calvin's team had already been reviewing as part of the broader audit. That drive turned out to be intact. The data on it included financial records from the early years of the company before Bianca arrived and before Malcolm restructured the internal filing system. Those records showed in the company's own accounting language exactly what I had contributed the initial capital from the sale of my father's workshop, the co-signed loan, the documented hours of community relations work that had been categorized internally as a contractor expense and then quietly reclassified after the fact. Malcolm had tried to erase my contribution from the company's history. He had not apparently thought to erase the records that existed before he decided to rewrite it. The picture that emerged was not complicated once the evidence was assembled. Malcolm had learned about the Waverly search through a contact in Charlotte's financial community. He had understood immediately what it meant that a woman named Talia Avery was about to become very wealthy and that his wife was that woman. Rather than telling me he had spent the following months constructing an exit timed, not because he had fallen out of love, but because he needed me legally separated and financially isolated before the Waverly family found me. He had done all of it in silence because silence was the tool he trusted most. It had worked on me for years inside the marriage. He had reason to believe it would work one more time. The day before the final hearing, Odessa discharged from the hospital 2 days earlier. Steadier than her doctors had expected, asked to see me alone. She was seated in the main sitting room when I came downstairs, and she looked like herself, composed, direct, taking up exactly the amount of space she intended to. She didn't begin with an apology for the family members who had looked at me the wrong way when she was admitted. She simply looked at me and said, "You told me once that people can take many things from you, but they can only erase your name when you stop standing up for it. Do you still believe that?" I told her I did. She nodded once, the way someone does when they've heard the answer they needed. "Then go stand up for it tomorrow, in that room, in your own voice." She reached over and put her hand briefly on mine, not a gesture of comfort exactly, but of something more like recognition. One person who had been told their name didn't matter acknowledging another. Then she picked up her tea and the conversation was over. I walked into the final hearing the following morning without notes. Everett's legal team had prepared extensive documentation and expert testimony, and Calvin Reddick was present to walk the court through the forensic findings. But when the judge asked if I wished to make a statement, I stood up and spoke without a script. I described what 16 years of a marriage built on unacknowledged contribution looked like from the inside. I described what it felt like to sign a document inside a stack of tax forms because your husband had told you it was a routine restructuring. I described what it meant to discover that the silence you had spent years trying to interpret charitably had been the whole time a strategy. I didn't perform grief or anger. I just told the truth as plainly as I could, and I let the room sit with it. Everett followed with the legal argument. The fabricated agreement Malcolm had submitted was not only fraudulent, It was structurally incapable of achieving what Malcolm claimed because the original contract contained a non-transfer clause that my father had insisted upon and that preceded any agreement Malcolm could have constructed. The fact that Malcolm had removed it from the version he presented to the court proved he had known it existed. He had attempted to steal something the law had never permitted him to touch, and he had done so with full knowledge of the obstacle he was removing. The court threw out the fraudulent transfer agreement. The divorce settlement was voided in full on the grounds of fraud. I did not ask for the marriage to be reinstated. I had no interest in being Malcolm's wife again. I asked only for what had been taken. My father's equity, my financial standing, and the record of my contributions to a company I had helped build from nothing. Malcolm was arrested outside the courthouse. The charges covered financial fraud, document falsification, and misappropriation of community development funds. Bianca, who had spent the weeks of the investigation quietly repositioning herself as a cooperative witness, discovered that cooperative witnesses still face consequences when the metadata on the fraudulent documents traces directly to their workstation. She had created the forgeries. She had managed the shell companies that received the redirected project funds. The testimony she offered against Malcolm implicated her as thoroughly as it implicated him. Merritt and Rhodes Urban Capital did not survive the proceedings. Its assets were frozen, its projects placed under court supervision, and the community reinvestment funds that had been diverted were ordered, returned, and redistributed under independent oversight. The neighborhoods that had been promised development and received nothing would finally get what they had been told to expect. When Malcolm was led out of the courthouse, he turned and called my name. It was the first time in over a year that he had spoken it directly, not through an attorney, not through a text, not through the pointed silence that had been his preferred language for so long. I didn't turn around, not because I wanted to punish him with the same treatment he had given me, but because there was nothing left in that direction that I needed. The silence I chose in that moment was not his weapon returned. It was my boundary drawn at last on my own terms. In the weeks that followed, I formally accepted the equity position my father had earned. The Waverly Consortium held a small private ceremony to restore Lionel Avery's name to the founding records of the logistics division, a correction that should have been made decades earlier, acknowledged by the family with the directness that Odessa seemed to bring to everything. Everett drafted the legal charter for what came next, and he included a single condition of his own. No clause in the document would permit any outside party, including the Waverly Consortium, to override my operational decisions. He handed it to me and said, "This is yours. It should stay that way." I used the first distribution from the restored equity to buy back my father's old workshop in West Charlotte. The building had changed hands twice since I sold it, and it needed significant work, but the bones were solid. My father had built things to last. I hired a contractor and spent 3 months overseeing the renovation myself, the way I suspected my father would have wanted. When it reopened, it was called the Avery Second Shift Center. The center offered legal consultation for women navigating divorce and financial abuse, forensic review of personal financial records, vocational retraining for people who had stepped back from careers to support a family and needed a path back in childcare support, and an emergency fund specifically for women who had been locked out of accounts or removed from homes without resources. The name came from the idea that a second shift wasn't a setback. It was simply the moment when the real work began. Odessa became an informal advisor, the kind who called occasionally to ask pointed questions and expected honest answers. Everett drafted the center's legal charter with a condition he named himself: no outside party, including the Waverly Consortium, could override any operational decision I made. Janelle was there on the opening day, not at the podium, not in any photograph, just standing near the back of the main room, watching with the expression of someone who had waited a long time to see a particular thing happen and was quietly satisfied that it finally had. My father's red toolbox was placed in the lobby on a low shelf visible from the entrance. Beneath it, on a small card mounted to the wall, were the words, "I had said to an angry woman in a rehabilitation facility 13 years ago, not knowing they would eventually find their way back to me." A name built on truth cannot be erased by silence. On the morning the center opened, a woman came through the door carrying a single bag. She looked the way I remembered feeling, not broken exactly, but untethered, as if the floor she had always stood on had been pulled from beneath her, and she hadn't yet figured out where to put her feet. She stood just inside the entrance and looked around like she wasn't sure she was allowed to be there. I walked over and opened the inner door for her myself. Outside, at the far end of the parking lot, an understated black car sat quietly at a distance. No convoy, no silver emblem catching the light, no demonstration of anything. Odessa had come, but she had come the way people come when they want to bear witness, rather than take credit. I had spent 16 years building things for other people, and watching my name disappear from what I'd made. What I know now, and what I wish I had understood much sooner, is that a person's name isn't just what people call you. It's the record of what you actually did, what you actually gave, what you were actually worth when no one was watching. Malcolm understood that. It was why he worked so hard to erase mine. Because a woman who knows what her name is worth is a woman you cannot manage with silence. If any part of this story felt familiar, if you've ever had your work dismissed, your contributions, rewritten, or your voice systematically removed from your own life, then you already know that this isn't just a story about one woman and one divorce. It's about what happens when someone finally stops accepting the version of themselves that someone else wrote. If this moved, you share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't yet, subscribe, because the stories we tell here are for everyone who was counted out before the ending was written.